Okay, great. Let's get started. I think the people are, yep. Okay. Welcome everyone. Great to see so many of you both offline and online. I think there are 15, I can't read it, 13 people online and about 7 here in the room in Amsterdam. Welcome back. We've had a 2-week holiday, well, break in our lab series. And today, the speaker of today is Flavio Azevedo, and I understood from Bert, he was one of the first.
You were there at the first political psychology meeting that Lelkes and Janneke van Toorn and I organized in Leiden, where you were just a bachelor student, right?
I think a first-year master student, yeah.
All right, yeah.
So a very early adopter of
Yeah.
psychology network that was developing in the Netherlands. I understand you're doing a very similar thing in Germany with the political psychology network there. Flavio is currently a research associate at Cambridge University at the Social Decision-Making Lab and at the Saxony Center for Criminological Research. His research is on ideology, populism, neoliberalism. He does looks very specifically at survey methodology. He has an ongoing series of data collections on political psychology and its correlates, and has a very extensive open science. Sorry, I'm a little bit cold. A very extensive focus on open science, and I love this acronym. FORTS is something that Flavio has co-founded and directing, a framework for open and reproducible research training. Of course, we're big fans of that here at the Politics Lab. So I'm very much looking forward to what you're going to talk about. For those of you new in the room today or online, the speakers take about 20 to 30 minutes, very occasionally a little bit longer, but we try to be strict. And then there's an opportunity for you to ask questions and for the people online to ask questions via the Q&A tool. And Bert here on the right will moderate the Q&A. Without further ado, I'm going to give you the floor, Flavio.
All right. Thank you very much. Let me share my screen with you. Can you see my slides?
Yeah.
No. Yes.
Yeah.
All right. So hi there, everyone. First and foremost, I would like to thank the organizers of the Hot Politics Lab for their kind invitation to present my work to you today. So this is a work in progress on the topic of measurement and meta science that dives deep on the theoretical and measurement practices that is published on the topic of ideology. So this work wouldn't have been possible without the help of Dilia Bolesta. So shout out to her and my dear colleague. All right, so in this presentation, it is organized as follows. We'll first have the briefest introduction to the study of ideology, then we will address the motivation, and we'll give you a summary of the presentation, and then what is our principal claim. We're going to talk about the methods and results of our 2 studies that we're going to present today, a systematic literature review and an empirical study in the US. And finally, we'll end the presentation by discussing some of the solutions of the issues that we're going to present to you today, with the goal of having a more cumulative, robust, transparent science. So if you would like to see cool visualizations about our work, please consider visiting our website that is devoted to the measurement of ideology, and we're going to build it in time as we get our studies out. So it's at measuring.ideology.flavioazevedo.com, and you'll find several graphs and analysis that might be interesting to you. All right, when it comes to the briefest introduction to the study of ideology, ideology is measured on a number of research disciplines ranging from social sciences, genetics, humanities. It is used as a dependent variable, as a predictor variable, as a covariate, a moderator, a mediator, but also to enroll participants in studies. There are 3 main approaches to the study of ideology. The first one is the etiology and ideational content of ideology. So think of the analytical studies of the content of conservatism in the US, in the UK, liberalism across the planet, anarchism, and so forth. The second approach emphasizes the means through which ideology is expressed. So think of discursive and communicative practices, so cultural symbolisms, imagery, etc. And the third way to study ideology is at the individual level. So ideology as taken by its bearers, right? So it's at this level that we're going to focus on, and mostly it is ideology study at the public, mass public level. So people, and as well as elite level, we're going to do the first one. So the studying ideology in the public, and it has mainly two facets. One that is related to one's sense of identity, it's social identification, if you will. So identification with a left and right or a ideology. And the other is operational ideology, which has to do with policy preferences or issue positions, if you will, when you aggregate them. So in today's presentation, we're going to mostly focus on the latter, on operational ideology. All right, so what is our motivation? So we think that given the importance of ideology to the studies of social science, including political science, social psychology, and political psychology, asking the question, how do researchers have been studying and measuring ideology? What are the current practices is an important question. And to our knowledge, while there is agreement on the lack of conceptual and theoretical consensus about the study of ideology, there isn't as of yet a systematic review of measurement practices and its consequences in the literature. So to address this, we reviewed the measurement practices by coding this into coding measurement practices in 400 articles in social sciences. So essentially, our hypothesis or our main idea was that the routine practices in the literature is to measure ideology with one ideological instrument, which may vary widely from one another, not only in content, but in number of items, the used scoring system, the dimensionality, and so on, but draw conclusions about ideology in general, relying on the assumption that these measures of ideology are interchangeable. So the standard practice is to tacitly assume that ideological inventories can be used interchangeably. That is to say, we conduct research using one ideological instrument or a selection of items from ANES, GSS, EVS, etc. But we draw conclusions about the nature of ideology in general. And there is a problem, which is that if this assumption of interchangeability does not hold, if swapping one ideological instrument for another yields a different conclusion, this poses a serious problem to the comparability of findings. So when you're trying to make sense of existing studies, the robustness and replicability of findings when you're trying to understand differences between studies, and hence the generalizability of findings on the topic of ideology, all of which impact our ability to accumulate science, accumulate knowledge, and move our science forward. So it is important to understand that depending on the heterogeneity that we find in the current measurement practices, we'll be able to adjudicate more or less the extent to which long-standing debates that we have on the topic of ideology. So for example, whether people are polarized, whether people are ideological, whether people are more symbolically conservative than operationally liberal, etc., whether these are somewhat influenced, these debates are somewhat influenced by these the lack of validated measures or due to practices in our field. All right, so what are our predictions? So the first is that when we look at the literature, we find high heterogeneity in measurement practices. That's our first prediction. And the second is that when we use different ideological scales or instruments to test different substantive claims, so theoretical claims, the findings may change as a function of the measure that you're using, which would be quite a finding, right? So that depending on the measures, the conclusion of the researcher would change. All right. Of course, these predictions apply to different sets of the scientific knowledge. The first one applies to the literature, the published literature, which requires a systematic review. And the second one relates to data, to testing empirically and statistically research claims, and we need an empirical assessment. All right, so to start with the first one, our first study, reviewing the literature, we decided a priori what would be our indicators of heterogeneity. So for example, assessing the number of articles with unique, non-validated or on-the-fly measures, as well as the number of the validated ones, right? We also defined a few indicators of quality or validation evidence so that we can better qualify our findings. And then just to make sure that we are on the same page again, all these research relates to operational side of ideology, so issue positions and policy preferences. So we are not, there are some researchers who consider, RWA or categorical labels as ideology. We're not looking at that, we're just looking at operational ideology. All right, so we collected several metadata about every article, and I am just scrolling through several of these, essentially on study specifics, sample specifics, information about measurement, and construct validation, right? So we collected all this information for all articles that we reviewed. And a total of 430 articles were identified, 136 via backward search and 294 via forward search. Then what we have, so this is the exclusion criteria. And in the final sample, we had 222 articles that we could code. So essentially, let's talk about the results that we found. So to the right of your slide, there is a visual representation of the ideological instruments that we found. So each color hue is an ideological scale, very thin letters, as you can see. And the thickness of each sliver is proportional of the times that that scale has been used. So we found 358 measurement instances in 222 papers, right? So that means that there is, for each paper, there is a more than one scale being used for ideology, which is in of itself worrisome. But perhaps more importantly, we found that almost 80% of the published research use unique measures. So that, to let that sink in, it means that 4 out of 5 papers are using a different measure of ideology while making claims about ideology in general. We found over 70 unnamed measures, which is that big chunk to your left on the bottom, 218 named measures, which is 75%, but only 15 measures appear more than one time, so in more than one research paper. The most prevalent scale is Wilson and Patterson scale, followed by an European scale by David et al. On cultural and economic conservatism. All right, so these are our findings. So these numbers, as you may think, are quite worrisome, and they seem especially high. So we consider that perhaps our review practices that were either old or not used anymore, that we do our science in a different way nowadays. So in this slide, what we can see is that the trending time is growing. Which is not to say that while we are publishing more and more conservative ideological scales, that also reflects the growth of the literature. So we're not claiming that we're producing more, it's just that we're still publishing a lot more research with ideological scales in it. Another aspect that we verified is whether this heterogeneity was localized in one field over another. So in this graph, we show that 36% of measures were found in political science, 53% in psychology, and 11% in other sciences, so sociology and economics, basically. We also looked at the type of novel scale and how the breakdown for novel scales are made. So in political science is much more a question of using different item selections in available surveys that are there. So GSS, ANES, and so forth. And in psychology, it's much more common to either adapt a scale that has been previously published or to use your own, right? So different practices, but yields the same problem. One last possibility is that perhaps these scales are being published in low quality journals or low ranking journals. However, our review indicates that on average it's common that these scales are published in high ranking journals. So in psychology, we see flagship journals in political psychology called Political Psychology, but also JPSP, PSPB, GAOP, NPID. And in political science, we find it in the American Journal of Political Science, Journal of Politics, American Political Science Review, and Public Opinion Quarterly. So this isn't a problem that relates to quality. All right, so far we established that there's a large number of ideological instruments, that it's as likely as that may be. We didn't investigate yet the content of this scale. So far we looked just at the sheer number of them, and we cataloged information about their validity, etc., which is all on the website. But now we need to look at their content, right? So we collected here and analyzed the content of 10 ideological scales, which are the most cited scales from our review. And essentially what we found is that in these 222 items altogether, we found 60 topics that are different in these 10 ideological scales. And what you're looking at in this table, which is mirrored left and up, by the way, is the Jockard Index, which is a statistics used to understanding similarities between sample sets, right? So we are finding that the biggest overlap are 0.32, 0.29, etc. So that is very low. Indeed, the average Jockard index of these scales is 0.01. So that means that even the scale content tend to share very little between themselves. So it's no wonder that we found a lot of scales, but that these scales tend to differ when it comes to content. They are asking about different policy preferences all the time. All right, so this is another way to visualize the same thing, but focusing more narrowly on the topic. So what are the most researched, what are the most surveyed topics in these scales? So you see that abortion is always seems to be in these scales, LGBT rights, religion, immigration, which are always are considered to be social items, right? Versus economic. And then we have our first item on government involvement. So all this to say what this graph is showing is that there is very little overlap between the content of scales. And as a final visualization, between I give you the overall findings, is that even when we are using the same scale, right? So this is the C scale, or the Wilson and Patterson scale, which we found to be the most frequently used scales. To what extent can we trust when people are using the same scale if they do this many modifications? From your left to your right, what we're looking at is the date of publishing, which field they published their research in, if they made an adaptation, how many items they used, if they use 7-point Likert scale, 3-point Likert scale, yes or no, what kind of scoring, and how they did arrive at a final score, whether they use the mean, the sum, or binomial. All right, so you can see that there's quite a lot of differences even when we use the same scale. All right, so this is a summary slide, a lot of information, but essentially we found a whopping 3/4 or about 80% of the measures we found are unique. There is very little content overlap between the scales used. That means that there's substantial heterogeneity, and that heterogeneity is in published research is even when we are using the same scale. So items vary in content, so depth and breadth of the construct, issue representativeness, item format, number of items, dimensionality, scoring method, latent technique used as well. So really it is difficult to grasp how much of a problem this is, right? It is large, of course. We also found that less of half of the scales had shown any validity evidence whatsoever. So not full validation, just, for example, reported that they did a factor analysis, even if they didn't report the studies, or they conducted a elbow test, or anything really, we considered it. So essentially what we are concluding is that based on the published research is that there is a lack of comparability, generalizability, and reproducibility in this, and this unfortunately leads to problems with respect to cumulative science. However, doesn't matter, right? So up until now, you can say, right, that's on the literature, but do you have evidence, direct evidence that that this matters when testing a given prediction, right? So sure, the literature is a mess. There's high variability and heterogeneity on how we measure ideology. So for sure, this begs the question to what extent it matters, right? Does it matter practically? So to answer this question, we collected empirical data in the US while using different ideological instruments to test the same claims in political psychology. So we surveyed 101,500 people in the US, and we also surveyed another 2,000 as a replication sample. We controlled for quality control, time checks, etc., and it was representative with respect to income, education, gender, and age. All right, so which scales did we survey? We surveyed social and economic conservatism by Hennigan, the Pew Research Center core of issues on American politics. I will refer to this as Zell and Bernstein. Then Feldman and Johnston's famous 2014 study in political psychology, Embark, Pizarro, and Bloom 2009 study, and Social and Economic Conservatism Scale 2013 by Everett. So we surveyed all these items, 63 items in total. All right, and we're going to use for case studies to show you that indeed there seems to be differential functioning for each of these scales, meaning that I hope to show you that depending on the scale that you use, we find different substantive findings. All right, so let's start with the first case, which is Ellison and Stimson's famous book, Ideology in America, which is a widely replicated study in almost every survey in political science, whose principal claim is Americans are symbolically conservative and operationally liberal, right? So in the graph, you see the expectation, which is that the symbolic graph is to the right, so meaning more conservative, right here. And when you ask their their position on policy issues, the Americans tend on average to be more on the left, more less conservative, if you will. All right. Moving to results of using empirical data, this result shows that the distribution of operational ideology, that's the light green, and our measure of symbolic conservative ideology in purple. So we are observing a successful replication that is based on this ideological scale. Out of the 5 that we have, we showed a statistically significant result that could infer that indeed Ellison and Stimson study got it right, and it's a successful replication, right? However, using another ideological scale, I'll talk about which in a second, we do observe a complete reversal. That is, based on this ideological scale here, one could statistically infer that Ellison and Stimson actually got it backwards, that Americans tend to be, Americans on average tend to be more operationally progressive than symbolically, right? Which has a lot of repercussions for how we understand American politics. So in general, looking at all scales here, I just put the abbreviation on the left side. And it shows all 5 ideological instruments, and the dotted line in the center is the center of the symbolic ideological measure. So essentially what we're seeing here is that we find for one scale, Everett scale, a complete reversal. We find a successful replication for Feldman and Johnston, as well as Zell and Bernstein's. And they happen to be also scales that are published in somewhat political science work. So Pew Research Center is a general center, but still, political science C. So they replicate the work by Ellison and Stimson, and you have in yellow the null results, right? So there's no differences between the distributions of symbolic ideology and operational ideology. So essentially, the conclusion of this is that the findings for this claim appears to be contingent on the measures that you used. Of course, we didn't measure, we only used 5 scales, and we could do this with 20 scales, but essentially what I'm trying to show is that this matters. All right, the second case study is that Lelkes 2016, possibly one of the highest impact works of the last decade. The claim is that Americans are not yet ideologically polarized. So the visualization in this slide aims to show you that the expectation of low, moderate, and high polarization according to the author, right? And what I'm hoping to show you when it comes to effect sizes is that for moderate polarization, the hedge is G, so that's similar to Cohen's D, so that's a measure of effect size, is 2.4, which can be considered extremely high in most standards used. So in this simulation, to make this graph, I show you that already the author chose a methodology that is a little biased towards not finding polarization, right? So this is just a context. And these are the results of the five ideological scales plus the symbolic ideology. And once again, what we're looking at is that the results differ depending on the scale used. So essentially, for Feldman and Johnston, Ibar, Pizarro, and Bloom, and Zell and Bernstein, we do find moderate polarization, but we do not find for the other scale. So once again, the results change depending on the scale used. What is very good, recently I got the news from Research and Politics, so we got in principle acceptance for this paper that we are finishing writing it up. All right. The last case study, as I approach to 20 minutes of presentation, is on whether ideology predicts distrust of climate change far and above other variables. So we put 18 variables that are thought to be predictive of ideological of climate change distrust. And we conducted what is called a multiverse analysis. Essentially, we run every possible model, and we plot here on your right the coefficient distribution, meaning the beta coefficients. And what you're looking at is the distribution of the coefficients on the dependent variable, which is climate change distrust. So what we are observing in these results is that these two ideological scales, which is Zell and Bernstein and Ibar, Pizarro, and Bloom, are 100%. So no matter how you make your model, they are a significant predictors of, and they are the best, the strongest predictor of distrust in climate change. But other scales, so Feldman and Johnston and Everett, for example, perform particularly poorly when it comes to predicting distrust in climate change. So all this to say is that there's a lot of debate on whether ideology or partisanship, for that matter, which is here, matters to predicting climate change distrust. And what we are showing is that it depends on the scale that you use. All right, so I have another case study here, but this is a sort of a pseudo case study, but this is widely used in the literature, especially in public opinion research, which is to, sort of plot people's political opinions on a 2x2 graph, so social and economic ideology, for example, right? And show that this too, whether there are libertarians, for example, Lee Drutman, an amazing institutionalist of American politics, said in one article that libertarians compose a very little part of the American public, right? And what we are showing here is that it really depends on the scale that you use, and it can go up to 20-25% depending on the scale used. So we do find one scale with 5%, but we do find also 25. Another interesting thing is that this tends to correlate with self-identification for libertarianism. All right, moving to a summary and then recommendations and conclusions. So the main takeaway of my presentation is that we've been conducting research on ideology as if we are all using one and the same measure. But this measure is a very special measure, a very perfect measure, a single predefined, well-tested, cross-nationally validated measure. So we are doing research as if we had a standardized, agreed upon consensus measure, but unfortunately that's not the case. And we show this with the systematic literature review and our empirical study. And this may lead to research results that are idiosyncratic to the scale used, posing a threat to the replicability and generalizability of findings. So in taking stocks, these characteristics have been associated with a failure to replicate. So when you look at the literature, the literature is riddled with jingle fallacies. So if you don't know, they refer to erroneous assumptions about whether two instruments bear the same name but are different measures, or they are identical measures but they are labeled different. And we speculate that it's unlikely that operational measures are equally good indicators of ideology. They do not present desirable validity properties, and that they cannot be used interchangeably. So an important implication of this work is that the conceptual and measurement problem that pervades the research literature has consequences, I think personally, for how we think about ideological thinking, whether people are ideological or not. So if the basic measurement of ideology is flawed, it's likely that insights from research on whether people are ideological or hold ideological beliefs meaningfully cannot be trusted. So without reliable measurement, the level of ideological thinking remains underestimated, and the relationship between one's ideology and their individual opinions on different policy issues appears to be contingent based on these results. So when it comes to ways forward, I would recommend 4 steps. The first is a push for institutional efforts towards a standardized measurement. At least we know the properties across groups. So developing invariant properties across populations that are, say, time, but public opinion is always changing, depends on candidates, depends on parties, etc. But perhaps we can, like the ESS surveys that they develop their measures. I believe we can do the same for ideology that are contingent, right? So that are context specific, right? Probably there isn't an ideological measure that can be used across the world, right? Different histories, different political contexts, etc. I also argue for a more theory-based measurement of ideology, so strengthening the link between measurement and theory on what constitutes ideology, and to qualify findings on ideological topics rather than ideology. So essentially saying that if you find a relationship between A and B, you mention not ideology, but you're saying, oh, this sort of generalizes to climate change opinions, to policy on abortion, etc. So to social and economic issues. And I would say that we need to use methods that allow us to make comparisons between surveys, like test equating methods. All right, this is it for today. I hope I did it in good time. And thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Flavio. Now we have good 20 minutes for Q&A. For those of you who are on Zoom, you can type your question in the Q&A box, and then as these questions will come in, we'll read them out. Flavio, you can read along, but the people that are in the Zoom can't, so therefore we'll read them out. But first, a couple of questions in the room, and if you're on Zoom, just type in the Q&A box. We will get you. So I have Son and then Son.
Hey, hi, thanks so much for this talk. I really liked it. You have amazing visuals. That's really amazing. And I also think that I've kind of gone through the same process as you have. When I was conducting a meta-analysis that's soon to be published, I was going through the same thing where I was just so annoyed at everyone measuring everything slightly different, even though they were actually kind of trying to get at the same thing. And I was just like, when I was gathering my data for the meta-analysis, I'm just going through work, just telling this to everyone, and I still am annoyed by it. And I still think a lot of the differences between measurements are just unnecessary. But on the other hand, what I always got back was that people say, yeah, but everyone's trying to measure something slightly different. And everyone's, is just going from a question-driven research and has just a slightly different question, and that makes for a slightly different measure. Now that doesn't mean that, measuring things on a 3-point scale and a 7-point scale, come on, let's just kind of all do it the same way. That would be really nice. But question wording just really matters a lot. Like an example is how someone feels about vaccination was a totally different question 4 years ago as it was 1 year ago as it was now. And I'm also publishing a paper now about how do we measure views on homosexuality. And that also, the views on homosexuality have changed so much in the last few years that the standard measures are actually kind of useless now. And that we really have to work on new measures that haven't been tried and tested, but are necessary. So I don't know, I share a lot of your ideas, but at the same time, I just think, but we're all having different questions as researchers, and the times are just changing all the time. You said these are idiosyncratic measures. These are idiosyncratic times, right? And I think that also kind of makes us need to look for new questions and ways to measure things, even though it's super messy. I don't know, I think there's a way in between where, yeah, some things should just be standardized, but some things we don't want to standardize. I don't know, I was wondering if you think about that.
All right, no, so I agree with you on a lot, and I think that it depends on the goals that we have as scientists. And I think that accumulation of knowledge, or at least accumulating knowledge on existing debates on whether, for example, the American public is polarized, or whether Americans are ideological or not, whether Americans' public opinion can be summarized in 2 dimensions, socioeconomic dimensions, or in other dimensions, or even in left and right. So there's these everlasting debates for which different people are constantly publishing research articles using widely different measures and sort of talking past each other. So the results that I presented for you, for example, you talked about, after COVID, right? So these results are from data from 2016. And we did have replications of this same idea in 2018. So we are pretty sure that this is the case. However, while scientific findings in social sciences are very complex and contingent upon space, political context, whether you have a democracy or not, whether your democracy is eroding. So while all this matters, right? When it comes to science specifically, our goal is to accumulate knowledge. And we have tools at our disposal. It's not like I'm talking about a problem that nobody ever thought about it. And we have psychometricians, and in the Netherlands, for example, are one of the best psychometricians in the world, the best groups at Amsterdam University, for example, where they thought about these issues on different topics, for example, on how to measure which university you select in the Netherlands, right? So depending on your scores, or intelligent tests, or educational outcomes, a wide variety of depression scales, a wide variety of topics that people are moving towards this idea of having measures that are followed up in time. One of our findings is that there is almost no measure that has been validated at one point and then revalidated at a second point. So essentially, my work is just trying to point out to this amazing, huge, that I believe that is huge gap in our goals for accumulating science, and saying maybe we should derive knowledge from other scientific fields that are thinking about these issues with the goal of accumulating science. Does that reconcile our difference of opinions?
Yeah, maybe, can I read really short?
We're gonna.
Was very helpful.
Okay,
Christian.
Hey, I was wondering, did you have a look if the authors specified what they understand of ideology? Like, I can imagine that some papers look at specific facets of ideology, right? And based on that, especially authors who made up their own scales, to think any justifications why not using one of the established ones?
Yes, so the literature quite literally has possibly one of the most, I don't know, unanimous consensus when it comes to the measurement and conceptualization of ideology. Since the 1950s, social scientists in political science and psychologists are saying, look, we're not measuring this right. And review after review, but not systematic reviews, just people, publishing papers on the issues of ideology, are saying, look, we need to do this better. We need to have the same content. We need theory. So a lot of these ideas are not new, but I put them together across the literature. So indeed, to answer the empirical part of your question, yes, folks are using different items with different contents to do to compose their ideological measure. And they also use different means. So as I mentioned, psychological researchers have a tendency to create their own measures and have lots of items, like 20, 30, 50 items, where political scientists in general tend to conceptualize ideology as an indicator of social and economic ideology, sometimes 3, sometimes 4, but not more than that. So the size of the measures are much smaller, which means that they are less reliable, but they are more one-dimensional. And you have, when you mention like, oh, there are different sides of facets of ideology, we don't know which they are because of that, right? Depends on the content of the ideological scales, ideological items that you use. So if you put 50 items there, of course, you will find that different topics relate to one another. Right, that's a consequence of how many items you have on your scale. And people have been saying, oh, actually, the American public has this many dimensions. So together with, just to plug in, together with a PhD student at North Carolina, University of North Carolina, we are actually taking a multiverse or sensitivity analysis approach, and we're estimating dimensionality for all ANESs from 2002, I think, all the way to 2020 to show that the true aspect of dimensionality assessment. So at least when people say, oh, what is the dimensionality assessment of American public, we could say, okay, which year and which items do you want to use? And at least we're going to have a mapping of that.
Okay, there's a question from Hulda Touristotier in the chat. The question boils down to this. To what degree is the problem of heterogeneity of ideological measures just reflecting you're disappearing, Flavio, but that was a Zoom thing, not a, maybe you were. Okay, let's start again. To what degree is the problem of heterogeneity of ideological measures just reflection of the fact that there's no consensus of how to define ideology?
I think a lot. I think how to define ideology is a theoretical question, right? So whether ideology should have items on abortion, LGBT rights, or the role of government, affirmative action, or even some folks include items on racism or items on affirmative action towards specific groups. And I think that what we need is good theory, really theory, just not good, just theory to say, look, let me define what ideology is for me. And within these constraints, within these limitations, I use these items. They justify their theoretical underpinnings or assumptions. And from there, you can sort of have findings that are contingent upon theory. What we do today, however, is not justify items whatsoever, your choice for content whatsoever, and you just pick items that, not to say that people are QRPing, are doing questionable research practices or questionable measurement practices at all, but it's that this thinking about, theory isn't well done, and this is what our work is trying to highlight, that there are consequences of not thinking about how you define or how you theorize ideology.
Okay, thanks. Gijs's questions.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Flavio. This is really interesting and great work. My question is about the end goal of this. It seems at one point you argue there should be one cross-nationally validated measure of ideology. And I think that's too ambitious, because ideology is also very much defined by what the political elites in different countries make of it. And it's a very dynamic concept because they have an incentive to keep on redefining ideology so they win elections. Yeah. So with that in mind, how can we ever achieve that goal you have?
Absolutely. So just to say, I didn't say that the goal is to have that. That would be on an ideal world if social sciences weren't that complicated, if humans weren't that complicated. I was just saying that we do research as if we had this standardized measure, but we don't, right? That's why we have lack of comparability, generalizability, and we're unable to accumulate science. So I completely agree with you. And I think that perhaps there can be, however, institutional efforts similar to how we have at European Social Survey, where there are measures that are tested across time. So ANES, for example, or GSS or other institutions that provide public data could have, start validating their measures instead of leaving this to individual researchers and improve on their measures. So that would be one kind of improvement. Now, would that be cross-cultural? Of course not. I don't think so. That would be my theoretical prerogative, because, for example, I think that the Netherlands is one of the best cases, right? Studying ideology in the Netherlands is by far one of the most complex social psychological problems. But maybe in the US is a little different. So if you have one or two standardized scales in the US, that at least the properties, that they are invariant across groups. So you're not keep finding results that only apply to whites, for example, or, be able to use other scales that might be, I don't know, maybe for some countries in Latin America, we can use the same scale, right? So it is possible, but definitely recommended that we try to investigate that. But we are at the very first stage of our progress on the measurement of ideology.
Flavio, I'm going to make my use of as my role as the chair to ask you 2 questions. Andrew Gelman wrote about type magnitude and type sign errors, and if I gleaned over your results, we're mostly seeing type magnitude. So different measures give us different results in terms of the magnitude, but very rarely do the signs flip. I think if only it was in the case of this one America's polarized, where there was really something completely different, the results were really different. But most of the times the results were in the direction, but there was just a different magnitude of the effect. If I understand my reading of the Gelman paper says, yeah, that could be an issue, that you have a measurement error introducing. So different dimensions, maybe different aspects of the scale are driving this result. If that observation is correct, my follow-up question is the following: would the would the next approach not actually be to take from these existing scales, just randomly create ideological scales and see which one gives you the best? So you can basically create all possible ideological scales out of the pool of items and see then if you start to have a varying effect size. Because for me to be, I'm okay with a type M error, but that is not so worrying as a type S sign, namely different conclusions.
We do. My cat is saying hi, by the way, if you can hear it. There's a cat who is probably hungry or wants daddy to, put her to sleep or something. So I'm sorry about that. With that said, I think that on the 4 case studies, I did show some reversals. So reversals is when you replicate a relationship A and B, but you find that in the original work, it was a positive association between A and B, and we are finding a negative association, right? So when there's a flip of sign.
Yeah.
So we did find that on all case studies, right? So not on all, because the fourth case isn't about sign, so there isn't a one statistical significant test. But I believe the Gelman's paper is incredibly useful, and your comment about the different dimensionalities, measurement error, all this falls into the remit of lack of equally good validity properties. So we need to test the scales that are available in a systematic way to know, okay, do any of these scales actually produce very good validity properties? But these validity properties, of course, are not, unfortunately, not general. They do not extend to every single criterion. It depends on what we're looking for. Are we trying to predict political behavior? Are we trying to maximize relationship between formative indicators? So meaning, do we want more constraint in a given setting? Or do we want, for example, that there is one unidimensional scale so that we can use just one score, and we want a two-dimensional scale, meaning that we can divide our ideological scale into social and economic ideology. So all this to wrap up, the answering of this question is that the unfortunate side of this work is that I keep saying, oh, we could do this, we could do that. And there are several implications for how we accumulate science, but there isn't a solution, so to speak. There are many solutions, right? And it depends on our goals.
Good, thanks. There's a question from Jordan Mansell. One question I think was covered already a little bit, so I'll focus on one, and that is the first question. Can you comment whether it's a conclusion of your paper that as a standard practice, research should incorporate more than one measure of ideology?
Yes,
and
that would be ideal. If so, which? That's the one I don't know. So perhaps we can do a pre-test. You know, we do a pre-test. We select measures that are based on our goals. So if your theoretical underpinning is that ideology is a one-dimensional, so if you subscribe to John Jost's theoretical framework that ideology basically is divided, well, it's composed of left and right differences, even with a lot of variance, right? So what you want is a unidimensional measure. So use one that is unidimensional, that once you test the dimensionality, you find unidimension, and that has a lot of predictive validity when it comes to political behavior and associated constructs, whether they are political or psychological. So that would be my advice. And the same goes for if you on the other side, subscribe to, for example, Allershaw and Johnston's theory that ideology is actually composed of a social component as well as a economic component. So, and there are other papers, of course, with other theories. So I think that grounding your goals first on a theoretical level is more useful for you rather than me saying use this measure. As far as the scales that I surveyed, none of them have good properties.
Okay. Well, maybe we can find the last question that ends a little bit more positive. This is a factual question. Great. Okay, Cristiano Gianola asks the following question. Thanks for the interesting presentation. I wonder if the literature review searched for Akin terms for ideology, and if so, which one? In particular, I'm curious about the concept of political mythology was considered as a synonym for ideology. So at least a question. Yeah, and something positive, Flavio.
Wow. I'm trying to be positive. You know, there's many ways forward. Let's think it like that. Like, you know, almost anything you can do moving forward is positive. All right. All right. So let me just read the question again. I forgot it. Okay, so the research, we searched for ideology. We did not search for myth, no, but we searched conservatism, liberalism, ideology. I think that those were the main terms, but I can provide a full list of our search terms. We did a backward and forward literature search, and we included additional results that we found on the pipeline. So our search wasn't made through search terms. It was through a set of papers in which we look the papers that cited them, as well as the papers that get cited by them. All right.
Okay, Flavio, that makes it the last that we've just gone through the last question. I'll hand over the floor to Gijs to do a couple of announcements, but before also personally thanking you for this this excellent presentation, but also doing this important and really time-consuming work. There are probably easier projects to pull off than this one, but it should be admired that you're taking doing the hard work to do this to actually improve our understanding of this. So thanks for that. You will, once you're in the Netherlands, hopefully also come and visit us here in the lab, and then we will also give you a coffee mug from our lab. I don't see any in the room here today, but there are still versions left. So do come and see that as an invitation to come from Leiden to Amsterdam to visit us and have a drink with us afterwards. So that's it. Thank you. Gijs will do the last round of a couple of announcements.
Thanks, Bert, and I totally want to second what Bert said to you, Flavio. Very much welcome here and great work. So what's next? Next week we have Jochen Tolsma from Drutman University. His talk is titled Political Polarization and Residential Segregation. The week after that, Frank Gonzalez from the University of Arizona, Inhibition or Ideology, the Neural Mechanisms of Racial Priming in Politics.
Oh, Frank wants to get up early.
Yeah, he has to get very early.
He's in Arizona.
Yeah, so that's 6:30 morning, but he has young kids, so
Yes.
then last Friday of the week, November 25, we have Breakfast Friday, this time with Christian people and like Homan. And then the last presentation of the year will be December 2nd, Christine Schultz from the Amsterdam School of Communication Research, Neural Mechanisms of Polarization and Information Spread.
And then on December 9, Maaike, we have the Dutch Political Psychology meeting, and Maaike knows all about the program. Maaike.
Yes. So we have Borja Martinovic, and she's talking about how to understand intergroup relations. And then we have Ninette Yunusoglu, and she's talking about political socialization in a Dutch multi-party setting. And then we have Ming Boyer and talking about what we know and don't know about voting and why it matters.
Okay. Super interesting, and everyone is invited. That's a whole day event. Half day.
1 to 5.
Yes, and then 4 hours of drinking. Right. So
Right,
it's a
yeah, yeah.
Full day.
Full day.
Start in the early afternoon. So I want to thank the sponsors and WO Research Council and the sponsors we forgot. Oh yeah, the Association for Politics and Life Sciences. And probably many more. And of course, I want to invite particularly the people here in the room to have drinks together at 5 p.m. For the people online, well, if you're in town, feel free to join us. If you're not, then we'll see you another time. And Flavio, I'm hoping to see you somewhere at a conference, maybe Montreal. Everything is in Montreal this year, so have a good day.
Thank you so much for your kind invitation. Have a great day, everybody.